To all my hustlers, dreamers, love dealers, I'm that kind of girl. Work hard, play hard, for my own heart, might just rule the world. I'm on fire, can you feel the heat? You can try to, but you can't stop me.
This is Marcy Burrows and Carol O'Savin hosting the Midlife Mavens podcast, where we chat candidly about sex, love, relationships, and life for women in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and beyond. We're both psychologists who specialize in relationships and sexuality, but this isn't therapy. Thanks for joining us to discuss the ups and downs of life in the middle. We hope our conversations inspire and empower you.
A quick disclaimer. We're both psychologists who specialize in relationships and sexuality, but this isn't therapy. This podcast is for educational purposes only and is not a substitute for professional services from a psychologist or other qualified mental health professional. The use of any products or services purchased by you as a result of this podcast does not create a healthcare provider-patient relationship between you and any of the experts affiliated with this podcast. Let's get into today's episode.
Thanks for joining us today. Today's episode, we're going to talk about how we came up with the name Midlife Mavens, because it was a difficult process. And part of that, I think, don't you think, Carol, that we both had some kind of emotional reactions to the words that really describe this phase of life. And so we thought this would be a good topic to talk about. How does it feel to be considered our age group? How does it feel to be midlife? And it seemed like there was a lot of overlap with societal norms, societal expectations, just the view of women and aging that feels really different than maybe how men would feel about being considered an older man or an aging man. So we thought we'd have an episode about the words that we use to talk about women and aging, and some of the ways that gender intersects with aging and how that feels for women.
Yeah. I think too, we talked about how different it is than how we thought of ourselves or how others talked about us women, when we were at earlier phases of our life. So there feels like there's shift as we've moved into what we're calling midlife, but some would call older age range. There's a shift in how we see ourselves, how we think others see us, or how others do see us, and how we talk about that shift and that new phase of life that we're in. And it was, I think you're right, the emotional response that we both had to looking up, right? Because the words that we came up with, when we looked up other words for midlife, we didn't like the sound of that by itself. So we both separately did these dictionary searches for other words, and they were terrible words. Hag, biddy, witch,
Mature woman.
Yeah. A woman of a certain age.
Vixen.
Right? It was all of those really words that you and I did not feel like they applied to us.
Right.
And so trying to find something that was a sort of a middle ground of one that we could get behind, the whole idea of mavens feeling more empowering if we were going to pair that with being in the midlife. So that's kind of how we ended up here.
Yeah. Yeah. And really, it's kind of funny because for me at first, my reaction, because I think you came up with the term and it's got nice, what is it, alliteration?
I'm a big fan of alliteration. So that's typically my job, is to come up with the alliterative phrases.
It's got great alliteration. But I think because I grew up Jewish and it's a Yiddish word, my initial reaction in my mind, I kind of saw an old grandma type looking woman as like a maven. And then like having to Google that and find out that really that's not really what it even means. That doesn't even have to be a woman, which I didn't even know that. I always in my mind thought maven was a woman.
Yeah, me too.
But to kind of see that it's really an expert in any specific field, or it could also be something that you're passionate about. And so I think, helping women with this phase of life and providing a space for talking about that and a forum for talking about that is something that I think we're both passionate about. So it fits more. But at first, my first reaction was kind of like, oh, isn't that like little old, thinking of my Yiddish grandmother?
Right. So I could be a ballooning maven because I'm passionate about my hot air ballooning hobby.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the two of us could be psychology mavens.
Yeah. Yeah. Which I
Because
mean is,
we're
and that's how we kind of talked about this too, that there are thankfully a lot more podcasts, books, interviews about midlife now that thankfully that is starting to grow in terms of women's health. And there's a lot more dialogue that I think we're hearing. And we were talking about what do we have that's different to offer? And I think one of the things is that psychology piece. So how do you integrate this into your life? How do you feel about aging emotionally? How do you not get so caught up in maybe what society views as mature women or aging women?
Yeah. I remember when you and I were first tossing this idea around about whether or not we wanted to do this podcast and whether there would be interest in it. I run this consultation group that meets a couple times a month of other mental health therapists, and I went to them. They all are kind of in the 40s, 50s, 60s. They're all older, in our age range, women. And I said, what do you guys think of a place where we can talk about issues that don't often get talked about? And what are the kinds of topics that you would like to see us talking about? And so many of them talked about how they feel like they've moved from this place of being perceived as valuable, and maybe because they're moms or because they're attractive or because they possess something that others want, to being invisible, right?
Yeah.
I remember one of the women saying, it's both a blessing and a curse. I don't get hit on anymore, but I also don't get hit on anymore, right? And
Yeah.
there was a grief to that. I used
Yeah.
to be the kind of woman that got hit on. I don't get hit on anymore. And I think that shift feels like a loss
Yeah.
of some kind
Absolutely.
that needs to be dealt with from a psychological perspective, not just are you in the medical, are you in menopause, perimenopause kind of thing.
Yeah, I think it definitely speaks to how we identify, and if that piece that identifies somebody who's attractive, who gets hit on, who this is a part of my life, and then all of a sudden that's gone. There is a piece of maybe relief, but then also, wow, that's different. That's not how I see myself.
And the same thing applies more to you than to me because you've raised kids. I have not. But the empty nest, right?
Oh
That you
yeah,
talked about a little. I think you mentioned it in your intro in our trailer episode, that who are you, and how does that change things in your life, in your
absolutely.
relationships, in your job, when you're not, I don't want to say you're not raising kids anymore because they'll always be your kids and
Right.
you're still connected to them, but you're not day to day responsible for them, right? They're not living in your home. They're not depending on you in the same way that they did when they were
Absolutely.
younger. Because,
Yeah.
right, both of
Yeah.
your kids are out of your
Both of
house.
them are out. And
Yeah.
and I do think there's a gender piece to that. I mean, in general, I think certainly there are some men who take more of a active role in childcare and getting up with kids in the night and all that stuff. But in general, that does tend to still fall more on women. And I know for me, like I would wake up the first couple of years that my kids were not necessarily gone because my youngest was still living with me, but she was, in college. So
More
more
independent.
independent. I would wake up in the middle of the night with this like fear that I forgot to do something, that there was something around them that I forgot to
For
do.
her, yeah.
For yeah, like there was
For
some
any of them.
parenting thing that, and I'd have to like remind myself, no, they're grown-ups now. It's okay, you could go back
Yeah,
to
boy,
sleep.
that's a transition I don't
Yeah.
have any connection to, that having not
Yeah,
raised kids. That's different. Yeah.
that one was a really, really hard one. And it's, still I think even the balance, how do you balance how present you want to be in their lives with how present they want you to be in their lives, and how present is healthy for you to be in. There's so many issues around empty nesting, but
And I think different. They hit, like you were saying, they hit differently for men, for dads, than probably, at least from what I'm hearing, than they do for moms who have had a different kind of a role in those responsibilities around the house. And how does that change now that, or does it change much for a dad once their kids go off? Are they worried about them in the same way? Are they waking up a couple of times a night thinking, I've forgotten something? Where's my kid? Do I know where my kids are?
yeah. And I'm sure some, like my partner probably will, because he's been a single dad for a really long time. And so he will probably have that same experience when his son.
Right. It differs. I'm sure it differs depending on how responsible you are for the child rearing roles. If that's been very gender divided in your family or not. If you've been a single parent, obviously you're not sharing those primary responsibilities with somebody else. That would be harder and different, I suspect.
So definitely speaks a whole lot to identity and in the ways that we change as we get older, and our roles change, and how much we accept that and are able to integrate those changes and seek out new roles, expand our identity.
And that was the interesting thing then, that was the next connection that a lot of folks that we talked to when we were developing this idea brought up, which was appearance, right? How does our appearance change as we get older? And that's, there was a quote. Oh, am I going to be able to find it if I want to find it? There was a quote that we identified that had to do with appearance. Where was it? You had written it down.
Was it the Carrie Fisher one?
No, it was. Here it is. Now I don't know who the quote is from. Women suffer greater losses. It's related to aging. Women suffer greater losses because aging erodes the social assets of women, their attractiveness. I have some issues with that. While men gain from their most valuable social resources, their earning power and achievements in the public arena, women must hide their aging to be considered by society as distinguished. Women must hide their aging, not coloring our hair or not letting it go gray, makeup, hiding wrinkles, Botox, whatever those cosmetic procedures are, so that we don't look our age. Isn't that fascinating?
Yeah.
Because we lose something in that process.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of remember feeling this way on both, as a professional, on both ends of the extreme, like early on in my career. Because I think, like you, I went straight through and got my PhD. So I was young when I started. I think I was like 25, and I wanted to look older. Like I felt like I didn't get enough respect because I was so young looking. And then now
how can you be helpful? You don't know enough, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. But then and especially as a female, like I felt like as a young female, there was kind of like a double hit. There was that intersection of, how can you be a distinguished professional when you're a 25-year-old female? And then now on this end, I feel like I could feel some of that pressure of, wow, I should probably look younger to have more respect and be more distinguished.
Yeah, it feels like the social cachet that works for women, that period of time is much shorter than the social cachet that works for men is a much broader, longer period of time.
Yeah.
That's an interesting phenomenon that feels incredibly unfair.
Yeah.
We wanted to just briefly interrupt the episode today to make sure that you all have our contact information. If any of the content that we've talked about in any of our episodes brings up issues that you would like to explore with a psychologist, we want to remind you that Marcy and I are both psychologists and would be happy to consider working with you if it seemed like it would be helpful. So a quick blurb about each of our practices.
So my practice focuses mainly on work with couples and individuals around issues related to relationships and intimacy. I'm an ASEC certified sex therapist and work with things like communication skills, life transitions within couples, issues related to intimacy, mismatched libidos, any type of sexual problems in the relationship. I work with issues related to trauma and how that impacts relationships. And I practice from a neurodivergent affirming lens.
And this is Carol. And I would describe my practice as one directed exclusively toward individuals who feel like they are struggling to change some long-standing patterns in their lives. So you might think of those as core issues that have been present in their lives for a long time that are no longer serving them in the way that they did previously. So I can help individuals figure out what those core issues are, figure out ways of dealing with them a little bit differently so that they don't encounter the same kind of obstacles in their lives. I also work with a lot of individuals who identify as LGBTQ and with women who are encountering difficulty in their relationships with their moms as they age, or older moms who are having difficult relationships with their adult daughters.
If you're interested in working with either one of us, we both offer 15-minute consultations to assess if it seems like would be a good fit for your therapeutic needs. You can go to my website, which is Marcy, M-A-R-C-I, Burroughs, B-U-R-R-O-U-G-H-S, P-H-D, C-S-T.com, or Carol's website, which is drosaben.com, drosaben.com. We also have our websites in the YouTube channel notes for this episode. And now back to our episode.
I remember, so my hair is white. It's my natural hair color. I let it go white when I switched jobs about 12 years ago, I guess. When I moved to Arizona, I let my hair go. I had all the colors stripped out because I had colored it my whole life. I started growing gray when I was 22. And my mother and her mother and all of the women in my family have beautiful white hair. But I was 22. I didn't want to have white hair, so I started coloring it. And then I got to a point, I was, 12 years ago, I would have been just about 48, 49. And I was kind of tired of having to hide who I was. And so I decided to have all the color stripped out of my hair. And my hairstylist, who was a male at the time, said, oh, you got to be careful. Women who wear their hair gray or white, if you let it go long, it's going to make you look like a hag. That was what my hairstylist called me. I was 48 years old.
Oh my goodness.
I was like, and I became very self-conscious. At the time, my hair was short. Obviously now my hair is very long.
Gorgeous long white hair.
It is very long and it is pure white.
And very healthy.
Thank you. I don't think I look like a hag, but I think that just sort of encapsulated how people, other men in society see women with long white hair. I don't think that I look my age, if I do say so myself, but so many women worry about that and color their hair for exactly that reason. That was a big, when I went to him to get the hair color taken out, I got it taken out on a Friday, but we had an appointment on Monday. He said I had to live with it for the weekend and then I could come back on Monday and have the color put back in if I didn't like it. He was expecting me to not like it and to want to have the color put back on, which obviously I did not do, but that's the kind of, right, so much pressure about who we are and what we're allowed to look like and what are the assumptions that people make about what we look like given what we're doing. It's just, it feels like a lot to juggle.
It does. It does. And, I read somewhere, I don't even know why I was Googling this, and this was a while ago, so I might butcher it, but I read somewhere that women are so used to coloring their hair that when they start going gray, they are surprised because they never saw their mothers go gray because they were coloring their hair. And so everybody thought, well, you did go gray early, but a lot of women who go gray, I don't know what the average age is of going gray, but maybe in their 40s, I would guess. I don't know.
I would guess.
Yeah. But women are shocked because they're so used to not seeing women go gray.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The connection that creates for me is, and I don't know if you color your hair or not, because you have beautiful
I
dark hair
don't. I
still.
don't.
This is natural. Like you have no
It's natural.
gray.
My father, who passed away in his early 70s, was, I would say, only about 50% gray. So I guess I got his genes. He went gray very late.
Well, and I know baldness goes through the no baldness goes through the mom's side. I don't know how that all works, but to your point about we're sometimes surprised when we start to go gray because we never saw our elders go gray. That wasn't the case for me. But you know where nobody ever talks about going gray?
Where?
In your pubic area. Because pubic hair turns gray too.
Mm-hmm.
And talk about surprise. I don't know if other people have had this experience. Maybe it's because I went gray, my hair on my head started turning gray at such a young age. I started developing white pubic hairs at a very young age. And that nobody ever talked about that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I wouldn't think they would, because nobody talks about sex anyway. I mean, as a sex
Right.
therapist, I could say, like,
Right.
nobody talks about that. I think I actually shared this with you earlier today, that I was like putting on some nipple covers today before work because I was thinking, well, you can't have nipples. Like, like
Yeah,
the idea
right.
that our nipples can't even show. We can't talk about that. You can't talk about pubic hair. It's kind of funny how our society is so quiet about all of those
Right.
things. There's so much shame around talking about sex and
Right. Yeah, mom's grandparents, maybe older sisters would talk about that stuff. I don't know. I didn't have an older sister, so I don't know. But there, not only do we not talk about sex when we're young and we need the birds and the bees talk in order to know what is happening to our bodies in puberty, they don't talk about it when we get older either.
Right. Yeah.
I was listening to a podcast over the weekend, and the woman who wrote the book, and I'll try to put it in the episode notes, but her name is Lisa Mosconi. She's a neuroscience scientist, and I'm going to forget the name of her book, but she talks about the 3 Ps: puberty, when hormonal changes are important to women, puberty, pregnancy, and I guess perimenopause. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Or postmenopause. I'm not sure what she was putting in that third category, but we don't talk about, we're so reluctant as a society to talk about any of those periods of time. Yeah. Pregnancy is probably more socially acceptable than the others. I'm looking at you because you've actually been pregnant.
Yeah, I mean, there was like the What to Expect When You're Expecting book, and there's classes and but I don't remember very much besides the it's safe to do. But there wasn't a lot about sex during pregnancy. I don't remember hearing much about that. But yeah, pregnancy, I think there's a good bit of information. But
because everybody wants you to be pregnant, right? Everybody wants the procreation is seen as generally a positive thing. But isn't that funny? There's a class, I don't know about you, but in my age, and I don't know if they still do this, you might know based on your own kids, but we took a class on puberty and sex, and that in 5th or 6th grade. And there's classes on pregnancy, but there are no classes on perimenopause, menopause, postmenopause. And what would have happened to our class? What happened to the class for the midlife mavens among us, Marcy? Come on.
Yeah. It would be nice to hear what to expect when, how your body's going to change when you start to notice that you're not sleeping as well, or that you're feeling more brain fog, or that vaginal dryness, that's all normal, and versus there's something wrong with me. Yeah.
And so what it ends up happening, I think, at least this has been my experience, it ends up being a conversation among my 2 closest friends, right? Like, but with hesitation and reluctance and like making sure nobody else can hear us, right? Have you guys noticed this? Are you having this issue? Is this normal? I get a lot of those kinds of messages from my girlfriends, my 2 best friends.
Yeah. But then you've got a subject pool of like 2 versus, because I've had a lot of clients who had experiences usually after childbirth. Like, I think there's a lot about childbirth, after childbirth, like with depression after losing, what is the word I'm looking for?
Postpartum
Thank you.
depression.
With postpartum depression, see, there's the brain fog.
No,
My menopausal brain fog or my ADHD, I'm not sure. The
they're,
intersection.
they're similar. Yes.
But with postpartum depression, I've had clients who, do what you're talking about. They're like, well, gosh, I'm really feeling horrible. I just had this baby, and their friends have not had that experience. They're, having these wonderful
Right.
baby's really
Right.
easygoing. It's,
Right.
and then they feel like, oh no, there's something wrong with me because there's a subject pool of 2 or 3 versus,
Hundreds.
hundreds,
Right.
thousands. Yeah.
Right. I don't know about you, but in my practice, I find myself saying a lot of that, right? A lot of, yeah, that's normal. Lots of people experience that. Lots of people go through that. Lots of people struggle with this, and
Yeah.
they
And that's
haven't
not what
heard
they're
it from
posting
anybody.
on social
No,
media.
no.
So like with postpartum, there, all the happy baby pictures, but even here, like people are not posting, I'm having vaginal dryness, I'm really struggling on social media.
Right. Right. Yeah. And then
They're
it becomes
seeing-
a whole conversation about is it appropriate? Where is it appropriate to talk about it? Which goes back to why we wanted to do this podcast, because we wanted to give people a place where they could talk about that sort of stuff, or hear people talk about it in a way that was normalizing instead of stigmatizing or shaming in some way.
Yeah. I think kind of another identity area that I've been aware of is dressing, like how middle-aged women are supposed to dress. And that's been a struggle that I've been aware of. And I would think a lot of other women are probably aware of that too, that there's this idea of what's appropriate and what's not appropriate based on your age versus what you feel good in, and what your style is and things like that.
Well, and all of that overlaps a lot, right, with body image kinds of stuff and the whole sizism stuff that's out there. And can you wear that, right? Does that make your butt look big? Does that make your whatever? And then there's the whole overlap with age and where we put on weight, when hormones change during after menopause or in the menopause transition. And yeah, all of that becomes, and a lot of shame about it. Right? You shouldn't be wearing something like that. You shouldn't be wearing something so revealing or so, right? It makes you look too young or something along those lines.
And I think one way that kind of goes back somewhat to the labeling part, or what we call the show, is I remember for my daughter's wedding looking at dresses for mother of the bride. And, even if you think about like bridesmaid, or the word maiden, which I guess is
matron of honor,
or matron of honor, which just the idea that, I mean, you, because you're married or you're no longer a virgin, all of a sudden you're a matron versus a maid. Like that part.
Right.
Yeah. But so I was looking at the mother of the bride dresses and they looked matronly, which again, to me has a negative connotation. They looked like something I would expect my grandmother to wear, or, not how I see myself. And so I marched right into the bridesmaids, picked out a dress that I felt comfortable in, but I was aware, like, I was thinking, are people looking at me like you're in the wrong section, lady? But
good for you. So the other piece that we were going to talk about today that had today's episode was kind of on why names are important and words matter, right? What we call ourselves, what others call us. One of the things that we wanted to talk about, and we might have to go into this in more detail later, but in terms of what does midlife mean? Because we really struggle to find an age definition for midlife. And can I just say, most people say middle-aged, and we switched it to midlife because middle-aged makes me sound old. I feel older when somebody says, oh, you're middle-aged. That might be true, but I don't like the term. Midlife feels better. But does that mean 40s? Does that mean 50s? Does that mean 70s? Like, what is midlife? And I don't think either you or I found any definitive answers about that. So we just started thinking about generations and the different names that the various generations have. The boomer generation being at least my mother's age, probably your parents' age, the boomer generation and then the Gen X, which I think is where you fall. And I found a piece recently that talked about the Jones generation, which was a new one for me, which is the latter part of the boomers and the early part of Gen X's. And it fit because when you and I were talking about generations, I was like, I don't feel like a boomer, but technically I am because I was born in 1963. So technically I'm a boomer. It just doesn't feel like it describes me. And then this whole article talked about how the Jones generation, which I'm a part of, and a lot of people closer to my age, the younger part of the boomers, are called the Jones generation before Gen X and on down the line. So that was interesting to me because it fit better, the definition of the generation Jones.
The boomer generation, I'm just looking at the times, and it's like 46 to 64, which is like 19 years, and most
20 years, yeah.
And all the other ones are more like 14 years. So it is a longer stretch. So I'm glad they came up with something different. We also looked at who gets to name them, and we couldn't figure that out either, that somehow they just become a societal thing, that there's not any specific way that's defined.
Yeah, whose title sticks, right? Because when I was reading that article about Generation Jones, there were a couple of different titles that were used, but that seems to be the one that was agreed upon more or used more commonly. And who knows, maybe it just sounds better. Why we call Gen X, I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
But basically, as we're talking about generations, we're really talking about anybody subsequent to, I don't know, 1980, 1975? I don't know.
And I think a part of it is really,
85?
I think part of it's really how you identify too. Like, does what we're talking about fit for you? And if not, then not. But like, I think part of it is, how do you identify? There's the labels, obviously we use labels because it helps us communicate, and, we can say, okay, midlife, and you kind of have a general idea of what that means. Or we could say Gen X, and you have a general idea of what that means, but it doesn't really describe all the people that fit within that there's this saying Russ Harris uses in some ACT trainings I've been doing, he always says, the label's not the jam. And I really like that, because it's so true that, you wouldn't spread the label on your bread like you would spread the jam, because that's where all the good stuff is. And
that's right. Exactly. Yeah. So if the question has become, should you be listening to our podcast? Right? We're not going to determine that based on your age. We're going to determine that based on whether you feel like the things we're talking about fit for you. We don't really care what the name is. We don't care if you identify as a boomer or as a millennial or as a Gen X or whatever any of the other generations are. What we care about is whether or not you feel like we're speaking your language, right? Yeah. Whether we're your jam or not. So
if you decide we're your jam, we look forward to seeing you next time.
We'll see you in future episodes. Thanks for hanging out with us.
Bye.
This has been Marcy Burrows and Carol O'Sabin with the Midlife Mavens podcast. As psychologists, we are big advocates for therapy. If anything in today's conversation left you feeling like there is more that you would like to explore, we encourage you to pursue therapy. In today's episode notes, we've listed links for several directories you could use to find a therapist who's a good fit for you. Thanks for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you in a future episode. Be sure to visit our Midlife Mavens Facebook page to share your ideas about future conversations.